It's afternoon where I am, so good afternoon, everybody, to a new edition of the Art Business Podcast. My guest today has been on the news recently, and that's not the reason that I've invited him. It's kind of quite coincidental, I guess, but he is an alumnus of Sotheby's Institute of Art, where I'm program director of the MA in Art Business. My guest today is Adam Busiakiewicz, who was a student on the MA in Fine and Decorative Art. I think, Adam, back in 2015, 16?
Earlier than that, about 10
Earlier
years
than that,
ago,
2013.
2013, 14.
Anyway, you're very welcome, Adam. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here, David. Thank you for inviting me.
And what I just said about has recently been become, I guess, more famous, we might say, will become apparent during the course of the interview. But I think my main reason for inviting Adam is because I have done very little on this podcast yet to date on people talking about with interest in the old masters, the market for old masters, as the market still calls them. Art historians probably don't often use that term other than the inverted commas, but we might even talk about that later. Adam, we will learn more about you as the podcast progresses, but just to learn a few things about your interests, I was just going to ask you whether you have a favorite city.
Well, a really tricky question because I absolutely adore Central and Eastern Europe. I think you could probably tell from my last name that I have Polish roots. 3 out of 4 of my grandparents were Polish refugees who came here after the war. And I've always felt very much at home in cities like Vienna, where I lived for 6 years as a child, in places like Budapest, Prague, and on the odd occasion where I've been to Poland. But also, I have to admit, my favorite city of all might have to be St. Petersburg in Russia. I think it is a city that feels, well, very unique in many ways, particularly if you're interested in Western culture and Western civilization, and you walk down those very ancient prospects and go to those magnificent museums, which to many, let's say, Western eyes, are actually very understudied and very undervisited, in fact. Some of my favorite works of art are in the palaces there. And I think it's once you're fascinated by Russian poets, composers, and obviously tsars and emperors, which have very long and illustrious histories, there's something about that city that that tops the rest that I've visited. Although I have to say a close second is, of course, Vienna.
Absolutely. I'm ashamed to say I still have not visited either place. I've only been to Moscow, which is a very different city, but has its own fascinations and amazing art collections, as you know. Vienna is the one that I feel really ashamed of not having visited. But one day I will definitely go there.
Well, the collection of antiquities is magnificent too. I'm sure you
Absolutely,
would find a lot
stuff.
to admire there.
Yes, absolutely. A quick word about Vienna. What do you love about Vienna?
Well, I was very lucky enough to spend my formative childhood years there for about 6, 7 years between the ages of about 3 and 10, 11. And I think really I have Vienna to blame for all of my love of history and art. I think when you're a young boy driving around with your parents on a Sunday morning going to the Votivkirche for Sunday Mass, you just can't help but be impressed by absolutely every piece of architecture and every piece of, I don't know, historic treasure that you just come across there. And it's not just, of course, the buildings, but it's the names of Strauss and Mozart and Beethoven that are ringing in your ears all the time, and not to mention a history that spans back even further beyond that, with the Habsburgs and the great emperors who left so many treasures in that city. It really is a unique place. And again, if it wasn't for living in Vienna, as I was for a child for all those years, I don't think my eyes would have been opened in the way that they would have been if I'd stayed here. Although I was born in England, I should say, in Warwickshire, but it really is an inspiring place, and I hope places like that never change.
I love those kind of places where, if I think I'm right in saying there's quite an Eastern element to Vienna. I know the Vienna Art Fair, the Contemporary Fair, which is something I've always wanted to take my students to, but it's never possible with the timetable. I know that they specialize in Eastern European artists and dealers, which would fascinate me. And it's those areas. It's a little bit like Istanbul. I think even Athens. There's a real feel of its Eastern history, both from classical times with Ionia and, of course, the Turkish occupation for hundreds of years. I love that tension between sort of Western and Eastern ideas.
Yes, oh, you're absolutely right. I think, easy to forget that the Habsburg Empire was a multinational empire. And, I remember go through a phone book there and you will see names from Hungary, from Czech, from Romania, from, Slovenia. It's such a mixture of different things. And not to mention that the Turks got as far as to Vienna several times on their various campaigns. So it really is a meeting point of different cultures. But again, that's why I love Central Europe and Eastern Europe.
Mm.
It really does feel like you're on the boundaries of somewhere very interesting. That leads to very strange and but also particularly beautiful and aesthetic treasures and marvels that we get to enjoy today.
No, absolutely. And may I ask, have you ever managed to get a ticket for the New Year's Day concert in Vienna?
No, never. But maybe one day, who knows?
Yeah, hopefully. Um, so the opposite of that, do you have some place that you really love to get away from urban life to? It might be by the sea or wherever.
Oh, good question. Well, I'm a Warwickshire lad originally, so I love traversing the fields and the ancient places that exist there. I lived in Warwick for many years, which has an ancient castle, which also I blame for my interest in art, particularly. But I think there's nothing more delightful than going to somewhere like Shropshire that feels untouched and very. Time feels very thin there when you're going off to a sleepy village and visiting the old church, which hasn't been touched, for in some cases for half a millennia. Again, we're very lucky here in England to live in a country, a very small one really, with such diversity. There's always a stately home to visit somewhere close by with an art collection, which has always very much inspired me. There's always, some woodland, some historic park, some town centre with some historic buildings to look at, or even a small museum. And I love that variety that exists here. I think Samuel Johnson was a bit wrong when he said, "If you're tired of London, you're bored of life." I don't think he was always right. Although I'm sure many people would disagree.
No, absolutely. And well, I went to university. I did my bachelor's degree in Latin and classical archaeology in Birmingham, and one of my memories was at weekends getting a bus out into the countryside, which happens curiously quickly when you're in somewhere like that. I definitely, I remember going to Warwickshire and Warwick itself. Um, yeah, absolutely lovely countryside. And it's quite ironic that I said you might have a place by the sea, because if I understand it right, it's probably furthest from the
Yes.
sea in terms of the place in England,
Yes.
Warwick.
Yes. Well, there's the River Avon, I suppose, and there's some nice swans,
Absolutely.
but I wouldn't want to swim in it.
Yeah, no, yeah, I know. I chime with you on all of that. And then I was just going to ask you if there's a building that you particularly love in your lifetime. That's a difficult one.
Many, many. I think some of the most exquisite examples are domestic architecture. Of course, I love stately homes. I'm forever visiting historic collections and places that have beautiful objects which I just want to admire in the flesh. And again, isn't it magnificent that 2 hours away from here I could be in Burley, I could be in Boughton, a bit further, and you could be in Chatsworth, and there's some magnificent places to see for their architectural value, but. I think it's often the domestic places that are so inspiring. Find a 17th century set of almhouses. Find a lovely Georgian, old farmhouse or townhouse in some sleepy village somewhere. I think those places can be just as inspiring, and it's almost like a hidden secret. Sometimes you can keep it to yourself or feel that you have that sense. Impossible to pick one, I have to admit.
I,
But any town has at least one or two buildings that like John Betjeman, I would want to stand outside and clap at it, for its beauty.
I totally, well, no, I get exactly what I think. It's a really interesting response because in the end, I think I certainly agree with you that in the end, it's almost like anywhere with a kind of history. And in some ways, the more secret it is, the more of a find when you're cycling or motorcarring around somewhere like Norfolk or Suffolk, and you come across these little hidden gems of, Norman or even Saxon churches that, you know, they are magnificent in their own rights as spaces, if you like.
Mm, completely,
Yeah,
couldn't agree
it's a
more.
really, really interesting response. So we're not so much responding to the, if you like, the grand architecture or the aesthetics or the importance of the architect's name, but just to the feel of the space that is being enclosed, even if it's domestic or religious or whatever.
Mm. Oh, completely. And again, I think we're very lucky here in England to have more than enough. And I just, as long as people keep looking after them and keep, replacing the lead on the roof and the broken tile,
Yes.
then they'll keep going for another few hundred years. Let's hope.
Yeah, well, a much earlier guest of mine on this podcast, Jeremy Eckstein, who teaches on the MA Art business. He's a finance, business expert. I know one of his roles was in I can't remember the name of the organization, but it's basically protecting the preservation of English country churches. And
Ah,
that's
yes.
exactly what you're talking
The
about.
Churches Conservation Trust, or
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, so he was very heavily involved with that, and just for the listeners who maybe don't know um, the United Kingdom as well as maybe they only know London. Just a couple of things I wanted to gloss that Adam was talking about Warwickshire and Shropshire, and I think many people don't think of going to those places, but as he said, you go to them for this secret England feel. It's not on the same tourist route as Salisbury and Stonehenge, but these places you should go to, you know. And then again, all of these little country churches, one of the reasons they need protecting is, of course, because local populations have disappeared, often through the plague and medieval period, and these churches are left like a piece of flotsam or jetsam on the beach, and we need to look after them because they're still magnificent features of our culture.
Mm. And the more you go to such places, the more you'll understand the likes of John Constable or Turner or any artist who reacted to the beauty of the English landscape. And I think every national school has their own landscape painters, but it seems very interesting that there were so many within this small isle that made such a mark on art history, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, and it's all miniature, isn't it? It's all on a much smaller scale.
Yes, sometimes. Well, or, some of them had a good go at making it grand and
Yes.
magnificent, but
Yes.
paintings aren't photographs, are they?
Absolutely. I mean, when you think of those romantic paintings, when we all know about when people like Turner couldn't travel abroad because of the Italian wars, and so they did their grand tour in this country. And one of the things they did is, I'm going to say they went to the Peak District and the Lake District and places like that, and they paint the mountains as though they're actually in the Alps, and they're actually
Yes.
very, very low, most of these, but they have a grandeur about them, which is everything's relative.
Yes, of course. Yeah, Richard Wilson being the most famous one who did that. But again, I think, if anybody's looking for a field to start collecting in, particularly, I think English drawings, watercolors, it's never been such good value as it is now to get involved and, buy artists and works that, were quite famous in the 18th and 19th centuries. And again, the more you love the English countryside, the more you sort of get to appreciate what a really good quality watercolor of one of these landscapes or little village churches is. And actually, the problem I have, particularly working as a consultant at Sotheby's, as I do now in the Old Master Paintings department, is whenever we have sales, I'm always going and snooping around what's in the drawings because they're more affordable and beautiful.
Apropos that, I was at Roseberry's a couple of weeks ago for their Old Master sale, and uh, there was a Samuel Palmer. I've bid for them before at Sotheby's, but that's another story. But I put in a kind of high estimate bid for this, and someone just outbid me. But you and I know that sometimes, as much as we want something, you realize actually that's probably too high a price to pay.
Yes, I agree sometimes. Although I was once told by a very wise man that you never regret your extravagances, only your economies, which is which is how I've justified any valuable thing that I've ever bought,
Yeah.
hoping that my nephew is not going to sell it in the car boot sale when I die.
Yeah, I
But
might
who
have done
knows?
that. Absolutely. Now, something that's very dear to your heart is music. And I wonder whether, Desert Island Discs is a program you probably know in the BBC, and their big thing is, so if you were on a desert island on marooned on your own, uh, and you could only take one piece of music, what might it be? It's a difficult one for you.
Well, impossible to say, really. Like everyone, my taste in music is as diverse as ever. Of course, I am a musician. I play the lute predominantly, and also the piano, accordion, and the
Hmm.
guitars. And
Hmm.
lots of people ask me because I play these antiquated things. Adam, do you wish you lived in the 16th and 17th century? And I often say, well, no, I don't, because Spotify didn't exist then. And whatever mood I have, you can find it. And of course, I absolutely adore classical music. I think like everyone, it all depends. It's all mood related. Like which part of um, your brain are you trying to hit with these, melodious sounds.
Hmm.
A specific piece, though, I mean, it's like if I could take one book, it would probably be the complete sonnets by Shakespeare, and in this case of music, it would probably have to be some of the clavier music by Bach. I mean,
Oh,
it
really?
never ends.
Interesting.
It
Yes.
never that music is understandably has been written and talked about for centuries as being the pinnacle of all music expression. I think it's absolutely true. Just
Yeah.
get a really good sonata or some of the Klavierstück or whatever, whatever, and you will always find new shades to explore.
I think if there was one composer that you kind of said that excluding Bach or excluding a composer because, they're just far above everybody, I think a lot of people would say Bach. I certainly would.
Mm.
As you know, I think even with people like Beethoven, I know everything's relative, but even with people like Beethoven, Bruckner, Mahler, and Wagner, still think Bach somehow stands out
Mm. Well,
above them.
everything's in his music. I know Mahler said his all the world's in his symphony or symphonies or something along those lines.
Yeah,
But yeah, some of that romantic stuff, as exquisite as it can be, if you're not feeling in a particularly full
true.
blown mood, then maybe you can't always find what you want in it. But
Yes,
again, this is the great joy of living in the age of Spotify.
absolutely. Did Bach ever make any, are there transcriptions from Bach for lute, or did he write for the lute? Because I know the lute is one of your favorite instruments.
Yes, I played it since the age of 17, so I should be much better at it than I am. But it's an enormous debate, and there are podcasts and things on YouTube that will explain it much better than I can. But ultimately, Bach was definitely aware of the instrument, and there's an awful lot of disagreement about whether his lute suites were in fact written for the lute or for a type of harpsichord which
Hmm.
sounded like a lute. And I think the general thought is that it's very unlikely that Bach played or composed directly for the instrument, but he did know many of the leading lutenists of the day, including Sylvius Leopold Weiss,
Hmm.
um, who was an enormous, extravagant player at the time. And I think there's even some anecdotes that they, in fact, almost challenged each other at an improvisation once upon a time. So could you imagine a lutenist sitting opposite Bach and having a go at outdoing one another? So, but whatever the case may be, I think transcriptions for the instrument, for lutes, for baroque lutes, which can be very big types of instruments of the 18th century, are still exquisite, but they sound just as good when John Williams or Julian Bream plays them on the classical guitar. But that's the genius of his music. It doesn't matter what instrument it's on. Um, you know,
Absolutely.
there's a place for geeks and nerds to want to get completely historically accurate, um, but the music shines through.
And Adam, I was just going to ask you, do you have your lute with you at this moment? Would you?
Yes, I do, because you asked.
You're
So
not
here
meant to
it
say
is.
that. There it is, a beautiful, beautiful instrument. Someone once described it as like the the rock stars acoustic guitar that they always take. They always turn up at parties and play this instrument. It was an instrument you could carry around with you and amuse anyone at the time, as well as play for more serious companies, as it
Mm.
were. So,
Yes, well, it was often referred in the 16th and 17th century as the Queen of Instruments,
mm,
only second to the voice, which was the king of
mm.
instruments, the instrument that God gives to us all, supposedly, but not to me.
So
And
you're not going to sing and play.
no, I wouldn't injure the ears of your listeners like that. But it is a, it is a special instrument. And again, look at old master paintings. It's one of my favorite things to do, is to spot instruments. And I give a series of lectures for various institutions, including the Art Society. And the way I introduce it is, I so often look at paintings and ask myself, what does that painting sound like? If I
Yes.
had, that magical pair of headphones and I could just, plug it in, what would I hear? And that really inspires so many of my thoughts, and this cross connection between music and art. Lots of people, it's good fun to go to a gallery and, sit looking at 17th century Spanish paintings and hearing some Brahms or whatever, but that doesn't always do it for me. I think, it's this actual connection that you can get with a painting, like going in front of Holbein's ambassadors and playing the music that he painted into the picture. You can do it. I mean, and that just adds this completely different dimension to our appreciation of art in such a real way. And that's what I really love to do. And I've been so lucky that I've had the opportunity to give quite a few talks and performances in museums and galleries. That to me, I can't be bothered to make a recording of lute music. It's not really what I'm interested in, if you know what I mean.
So what you get to play for us?
Well, I mean, probably something quick, because
Yep.
this is a really nice piece of Dowland. John Dowland was
Oh.
probably the most famous of all the Elizabethan lutenists. This is called Mrs. Winter's Jump, and it's very jolly. So maybe your listeners will be jumping around. And I hope you can hear it, by the way. Does it come through?
Oh no, actually, so Adam, no, thank you for talking about music. I could talk about it forever, and I know you could. And your interest in the lute, if listeners go onto your Instagram, for example, they'll see your interest in finding paintings with always recording them when they've got a lute in them. That in itself is an interesting way of, I think, getting interest in art, is finding an object that you yourself personally love and or is in your life as a hobby or whatever, and just looking for works of art that have that in them. But talking about art, do you have a favorite work of art or an artist, or again, is it just a general style or a mood?
I think such questions are always going to be complicated because it is so mood related. I suppose it's often British artists that hit me in the stomach the most and the most often, and maybe that's just the case that, again, we have a lot of great British art here in England. Although after having visited some museums in America, I never cease to be amazed about how many magnificent things are there. But I can't help but express a love of the likes of Joshua Reynolds. Some of his portraits, not all, but many of them, can be just absolutely knockout. He had a formula that worked and injected just enough poetry into a painting to make it otherworldly. So he's an artist that I never stop admiring, and very luckily, I suppose, he, of course, is now the most expensive British artist that's ever been sold, since Omai made 50 million, you might say, being sold to the NPG and to the Getty. That's it. Sorry, Getty, last year. But of course, it's also the case of landscape painters. I love the likes of Francis Town, the English watercolor painter of the late 18th century. I also love Richard Parkes Bonington. When I used to work at Sotheby's and when we would research a potential Bonington, it never gave me, it never stopped being, just the most magical experience going through the catalogue raisonné that was, made with these illustrations. He was just, such a talent. And if he would have lived longer, I think we wouldn't be talking about Turner, we'd be talking about Bonington. But then again, in terms of more old masters, any music in a painting just, just has its has its place in my heart as well. It is mood dependent, and traveling around Europe, traveling around this country, you get to see so many different types of things. No museum is the same, as we know. No country house is the same. I think there's always something to be surprised by.
Absolutely. There was talking about Rosebery's auction house, the old masters. Their lot number one was this very unusual. It's called a dorsarium, so it's actually like rough linen, and it was hanging in a church in. They can't quite get the provenance, either Suffolk or Norfolk. And it was basically Maria Assunta in the center, 15th century, and it had angels on either side. And one of the things I noticed is, although it was very faded, is that the angels were playing musical instruments and some were probably singing from scrolls. And that comes back to what you were saying earlier about hearing the music. And that's exactly what I could actually hear that music playing when I looked at it. When I spoke to some other people there, they don't necessarily have the same experience with that. And so I would say to all listeners, do if there's music in a static painting that you're looking at, or sculpture, or other things, including human beings that are making sound. I
Mm.
think I think viewers at the time, in particular, when they saw that, as you say, in the Holbein Ambassadors, they probably many of the viewers of that work would actually hear the music playing.
Yes.
It's really the interesting way to look at works of art.
Yes, again, it's very tricky sometimes to make people think with their and look, sorry, with their ears. Think
Yes.
about the sounds that are coming out of things. But also, I understand it's very tricky. The V&A, for example, used to have a big musical instrument department, and that was, of course, swept away slightly for fashion, which is far more popular, and
Mhm.
I understand that. But looking at historic musical instruments is also a great joy. But
Yes.
having that ability to think that these are objects that were meant to be played, were meant to produce sounds, and they are, of
Mhm.
course, instruments, although they can be extremely beautiful and decorated just as much as any piece of 17th century furniture was, with inlays and various decorations with various types of woods. But yes, looking with your ears is another way, as many ways of exploring and enjoying art.
And Adam, you said a little bit earlier on, I think, about your early upbringing and places like Vienna. Um, maybe you could say a little bit about the the journey, if you like, to deciding to study history of art. Oh no, history at University College London, and then how that slightly metamorphosed into an extension of history, the history of art, by studying the masters in fine and decorative art and design at Sotheby's. Maybe you could say a little bit about how you got into art and
Cool.
why you chose certain educations and how that affected you.
Yes. Happily. It's a very interesting story, really, because I don't think I actually ever studied art formally until I did my master's degree at the Sotheby's Institute. My first degree was in history. I came out of my A levels as a sort of young man with a great love of the past, but I didn't exactly know what it meant at the time. And so when my first degree was progressing, I soon discovered that what, I really am not interested in political history whatsoever, despite the fact that I took many different courses and I was always trying to write about cultural history. My BA dissertation was on Egon Schiele, and I wrote
Mm,
essays about the architectural history of Petersburg, for example.
mm,
But really, it was my first job out of my BA that I all of a sudden became interested in studying history through objects. I worked at a place called Warwick Castle, which is privately owned by an entertainment company now. But it had and still has the remains of what was a once great collection of paintings and furniture and arms and armor. And it just immediately inspired me to actually take an object as a starting point and then work its history out from that. And when after a few years of working at that place, I had a few bits of experience under my belt, and I'd also been really lucky to meet some fantastically inspiring people from Sotheby's and associated branches, like Thomas Dilmar, the great arms and armor auctioneer in
mm.
West London. Once you meet these people, I all of a sudden was thinking, well, actually, this is really what I want to do. I want to study history through objects and art history, and particularly MAFTA, the MA in Decorative and Fine Art, as it then was at the Sotheby's Institute, just absolutely screamed out at me as this opportunity to do object-based research, which I've never looked back since. And I was also very lucky, like I said, I'd never studied art formally before. I had just read absolutely every book I could get my hands on. But the lectures and the way it was set out, the way that it was so practical, and it fed into what I wanted to do, and I'm always very grateful for all of what I learned there and how I've somehow managed to scrape together some form of a career out of it.
Yeah, and presumably some influential teachers there. I'm thinking Chantal Brotherton Radcliffe, who we all know is very, very object based. If anyone has ever had the pleasure, if you like, of going around the National Gallery or art collection with her, she really gets people to look. I've been in the background where she's showing my students around works of art at the National Gallery. It's amazing the way she gets people to look from a distance and up close. And I guess you probably had furniture experts like Megan Aldridge at the time.
Yes. I'm incredibly grateful to Chantal, Megan Aldrich, Bernard, of course, who's still there, and also Constanza,
Yes.
who's doing ceramics at the time. It was a really massively important period of time for me, and not only in gaining confidence, but also let's say doing the basics up and thinking about so many different things, and actually it's that variety that also makes you realize what you really love and what you want to do. And I know so many of my colleagues that were in my cohort, my fellow students I should say, also had this experience, let's say, of just being thrown into this diverse world, and there's so many different strands in the art world you can go into, but also the different types of medium, the different types of art that you study on that course is such a breadth and also a depth to it. And by the time it finished, I thought, wow, I never thought I'd be able to do a picture test looking at some ceramics. Somehow I managed to do it, even modern art, which I have to say, despite my best attempts, I don't think Bernard ever gave me a good essay score. But that was also a massive lesson in itself, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. And you had the house sale as a project, I think, as an assessed project. Maybe you could say a little bit about what the house sale project
Yes.
comprised?
Well, the house sale project was again one of these fantastic opportunities to actually, as as an academic project in a master's degree program, to actually sort of put yourself in the shoes of an auction house expert, and be given a whole bunch of postcards, not real paintings, unfortunately, but postcards of pictures with no information. You had to go off and work out attributions, write catalog notes. And that is still the job to this day. I've been very lucky enough to work with the Old Master Paintings department at Sotheby's several years now, and I continue on as a consultant. And cataloguing a painting is exactly the same experience that we all got to have at the Sotheby's Institute. Sometimes you're just given paintings, or you're off on evaluation. You're looking at things on walls, and you have to, you represent a company that should know what it's doing and be the experts in these things. And that sort of practical, again, hands-on experience, and also meeting as part of that house sale project, the likes of Julian Gascoigne, the director of British Paintings, who I now work with closely, and a great knowledge person, but also dealers that come in and you talk and discuss these things with. I think it really is just an unrivaled opportunity to get hands-on and to actually learn skills that are completely applicable to what happens today.
Yes, and I know that well, please tell us about why you chose the artist Van Dyck for your dissertation, and what made you home in on. I think I know what the answer's partly going to be, because you've already spoken about your interest in arms and armor, and Thomas Del Mar, who the well-known armor dealer based in London, I think
Auctioneer.
still. An
Yes.
auctioneer, yes. Yeah.
Well, again, when I came to wanting to write my master's dissertation at the Sotheby's Institute, I wanted to keep it based in objects. And I had always had this question ever since I worked at Warwick, really, I have to admit, because there were quite a few armored portraits. And the question was, is what I'm seeing in a painting, did that ever exist in real life? And the question was, all of these Van Dycks British period ones, but also earlier, have these magnificently beautiful suits of armor in them. Did they ever exist? And studying what you see in the paintings, how does it translate into some interesting, historical nugget, let's say, of um, of getting a better appreciation of not only the painting but the significance of these objects to the owners, the people that wore them, and so Chantal and Megan were so very helpful and supportive of a very niche and very strange subject. I have to admit, of a very technical one too, because arms and armor is a completely, it's a whole different ball game of terminology and words to describe what you're looking at, and different styles, just as difficult, as studying furniture or ceramics or any decorative arts is, I suppose. And it was a wonderful opportunity to get under the skin of things. And I got to speak to some fascinating arms and armor scholars when I was studying there, who were very kind to give me their time, and to communicate through different ideas and different aspects that I had in mind. And I was very proud at the mark I got at the time for it. Although now I read back my master's dissertation, I'm very glad that my writing style has improved remarkably since.
You're too modest. Yeah, another little painting actually that was sorry to keep going on about Roseberry's. I mean, we're both much more linked to Sotheby's, obviously, but the reason I went down there is because I have a couple of alumni usually working down there, or they're very good to our students at internships. So I thought the least I could do is to go down there and talk about some of the old masters in their sale. They did a couple of Instas and YouTubes, but one of them, I was allowed to choose 5 paintings. That was difficult, or 5 works of art, 5 paintings. And one of them was after Van Dyck. I'm sure that you might
Yes.
know.
Okay.
And in that painting, I did a little bit of research, and in that painting, the Derby himself has got a sword, but he's not wearing armor. And it's very interesting because in this reduced version, which is just head and or half-length portrait, it's quite small. I noticed one thing the copyist had changed, whoever it was, had given him armor. And I make the point that I think that they've probably put the shining armor in to make the point that he was actually a royalist who I think he actually was executed after a battle fighting for the King Charles I, if I remember right. But it's
Yes.
very interesting the way armor becomes a symbolic thing that I think the painter had to put in to that, because
Well,
the sword was not possible.
yes. Well, you're absolutely right. Wearing armor was a sort of a mode of portraiture that existed, looking centuries back. I mean, think about all those effigies that you find throughout Europe, throughout England, of knights, actually, just noblemen wearing armor, even if they never, appeared on the battlefield at all.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what's really interesting about the period of Van Dyck is that they're going into a civil war. They didn't know it at the time, but they were going into one when he was painting. But also armor as a tool in the battlefield in general was sort of on the wane. Not many people
Mm.
were wearing it much anymore because the gun had made it
Yes.
in many cases obsolete. But still, they wanted their portraits painted wearing it. And one of the things I made in my dissertation was that this is you also have to take into consideration that this is a mode, this is a convention, this harking back to the age of chivalry. It's this visual culture essentially that was very prevalent in the 17th century that we today, of course, no longer share necessarily. Although I think that continued interest whenever there's a parade or a coronation or a funeral, hopefully not a royal
Mm.
funeral. It's often it's the uniforms that everyone absolutely goes bonkers over, but understandably so, because this is tradition. This is somehow our link to history, and I think in the 17th century this was also a part of that too.
That's really fascinating. And you talked earlier about your interest in English country houses, which I share that interest. And a few podcasts ago, actually, I spoke with someone called James Ward, who now does something very different. But he used to be, I think that what was he the head, not the head curator, but something like that at Althorpe
Mm,
House. And he spoke about the magnificent old master collection there. And I'm going to go to Althorpe in a few weeks' time for the first time.
mm,
But I know that in your blogs and some of your social media, you talk about with interest, and I think maybe even in an academic article, you talk about your interest in Guy's Cliff House, which is a. Could you tell us about it? You can tell the story much better than me.
Yes. Well, again, that was probably, I've been fascinated in English country houses for an awfully long time. I'm absolutely fascinated by their art collections, of course, because every country house, despite the fact of how many we have in this country, I'm very lucky to have them still. They haven't been, although many have been dismantled, of course, but still, some of the great ones are so intact, and it never ceases to amaze me, going into some of these places, how many original things still survive. But I suppose my first real introduction to all of that was when I was in my late teens, going to this place called Guy's Cliff House, which is in Warwick. It used to be a very ancient place of pilgrimage, back from the medieval period. In fact, there's lots of local Saxon legends attached to it. There was a famous, supposedly Saxon giant called Guy of Warwick, who's sort of like the King Arthur for the Midlands. Crazy story, really. He fought Danish invaders and monsters and cows and dragons, that sort of thing. And there's a whole house that used to, that was situated in where he lived as a hermit. But of course, unfortunately, today, no, it's no longer. It's in fact owned by the Freemasons in Warwick. They have ownership of this ruin, 18th century ruin, which was owned by the Great Heed family, who also had a very fascinating and long, complicated history, because they were also artists and poets, but they were also slavers, and there are some fascinating bits of graffiti, for example, in the caves that exist there of faces with African features. Again, it's just sort of, what more do you need as a 16 or 17-year-old to go to these places and be inspired by what you see around you, and you just develop a thirst to know more and more. And so I as a sort of late teen, helped on the volunteer party to help, well, in a modest way, restore and clear out some of the old ruins. And also I gave lots of guided tours there as a youngster, which was great fun. My first real induction into that, into encouraging my enthusiasm to be spread to others, and I've been very lucky enough to carry that throughout the rest of my life and career thus far. I think to be enthusiastic about old buildings and their preservation, as we've already said, is never a bad thing in this modern age.
Yeah, and I can imagine, particularly when you're a boy, teenager, that we love ruined places. I mean, it's somewhere that all kids, maybe they can't anymore because of things have changed. It's a bit more dangerous now to go out on your own with your friends, but used to love going into kind of, derelict houses and looking around them and so on.
Yeah.
And it's that it's a love of ruins, but already there, I think, in the young person's imagination, maybe through reading children's novels and things, which are often, well, there's a lot of tropes, aren't there, about entering the kind of, the secret garden, or, even in Charles Dickens' Miss Havisham's house. There was something about all of that I used to love as a kid.
Me too, exactly the same.
And I'm also thinking there's, I think there's an archaeology to those houses, isn't there? And there's an awful lot of information you get from them that you wouldn't have if it wasn't derelict.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's absolutely true. It's that feeling of the sublime, of what
yeah.
was and what is not now, and anything to spur on the imagination. Again, where we can't see, our mind takes over. But if anybody's looking for a fantastically strange place to visit outside of Warwick, they do guided tours there, and it really is, just phenomenally historic. And the caves that stretch back into the sandstone sort of bluff of that place is otherworldly.
That's brilliant, and we'll put a link to that in the podcast. And I was just going to ask you, I don't often ask people this because it can sound a bit negative, but it's not meant to be. I just wonder how the pandemic and the lockdowns affected you and your work, and maybe how it affected also in your opinion, the art world and its markets, especially the market for old masters, the pandemic years.
I was incredibly lucky to have a phenomenal and a very lucky and good pandemic compared to so many people who were suffering. Although my father was in hospital for several months, he came out and was okay, and it's fine. But I was very lucky. I was finishing off my PhD at the time, actually, and the University of Warwick, where I was finishing off, were incredibly kind with giving a bit of a an extension because, I couldn't go into libraries. I couldn't go into the archives where I had to, sort of gather together some final things, which was terribly frustrating. So that was tricky. But again, my supervisor, Professor Michael Hatt, and University of Warwick were so kind and incredibly accommodating. Though coming back to your point about the old master market and the art market in general, I think now we look back on the results that happened during that period, and the sell-through rate and the estimates that were being achieved was really phenomenal. There were some phenomenally strong sales that happened in that period. I think one of them is the Raphael Valls sale, the dealer in St. James's who had a sale of stock. That did incredibly well. Blowed expectations away, and I think maybe there was something to be said about concentrating people's tension spans in a way that didn't really, doesn't sometimes happen otherwise. People were sitting around on their computers and phones a lot. And and it's true. It's just sometimes it's those simple things. And still today, collectors, they need a sale season or a fair season, to really think, and that's understandable. There's a lot of art out there in the world to buy. I also think the move and shift towards online is phenomenal, and the success of online sales, and also particularly broadening out the types of people that are buying art. It was also a big shock and surprise, but it still continues to this day. I've been involved in organizing quite a few of the mid-season sales for old master paintings and the day sales. And it never ceases to surprise how many new clients come just because of stumbling upon something, and they feel happier to buy in an online sale than be on a phone. And that there are still people who are very happy to be clicking a button up to £200,000 or £300,000. That really is a phenomenal thing that I don't think enough people talk about. And I attribute it to the COVID period where people just had to make a change, and they did. There's an argument, that some people say, well, online sales aren't as exciting and the atmosphere is different. And that's true. There's an argument for that. But there's also, where it does work and where, you have fantastic paintings and objects at the right estimates that entice people in, it can always be surprising what happens.
And of course, even before we had online sales with the clerk next to the live auctioneer looking at bids online, it still wasn't as live as all that, because to be in the auction house, because there was still a lot of clients, important clients on telephones that you couldn't see. So I always think it's a little bit of theatre, but it's not necessarily any longer. You know what I'm trying to say. It's not.
Yes.
It is an amazing piece of theatre, and any listeners who've never been to an auction should definitely sort of go to a few. You learn so much about art and the art market and clients and bidding processes and so on. But yeah, I agree with you that and of course we saw this phenomenon that people are still now feeling a lot more confident of buying online. I think probably both of us would not recommend, though. I think we would both recommend that if at all possible, you must go and see this object in the flesh before you buy it, particularly with old masters.
Yes, I think things like condition, also questions sometimes about attributions and, but then again, I think I absolutely love, I have enormous amounts of sale room alerts that I get pinged every morning when I'm sat having my coffee. But, it can be very exciting to get involved. And again, beautiful things don't have to cost the earth. Old masters don't have to cost the earth. This is one of the, one of the things I'm surprising my friends with all the time. I have been, in my modest way, been able to collect things that I really love and haven't had to break a bank always for it. Some of the best things I've bought are in antique shops for £20. A maple frame, put something in it, and it looks like something more.
Yeah.
And Instagram too, I think that has, the amount of young dealers who are getting involved, who are, and also making an incredible mark, and many of them don't have galleries, and I know this is also reflected in the contemporary art world, which I don't know much about at all. In the old master world, there are some really impressive results and impressive sales that are occurring, and impressive PR that's also being established. And I've bought things off of Instagram without having to, without going and looking at them, which is probably sometimes a foolish thing to do. But I wouldn't recommend it necessarily. But That's the fun. It's like if you have an object that you want, and you know what it is, and sometimes you can't help yourself, can you?
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a risk, but so long as you don't, you know, so long as it's not too big a risk financially, I think that I agree with you. It can be very exciting getting something through the post that is you've bid upon and you're not quite certain until you open it up. It's a bit like having a birthday present, I guess, sent through the post and, oh, not another pair of socks. But, at least I think, we all know what we tell everybody who's thinking about starting an art collection. The trope is to buy what you'd like, only buy it if you like it, if there's an interest in it. Don't think really about the price because you're not certain whether it's going to go up in value or not, you know.
Mm.
So I wonder whether you could tell us your version of the, you know what I'm going to ask you now, that for listeners who weren't aware of this, Adam was actually interviewed, I think, recently by CNN in America, but also by, I think, BBC Midlands, because of it
Yes.
was this discovery was in Warwickshire. Can you tell us something about the events leading up to your rediscovery, if you like, of this very lovely looking portrait of Henry VIII? Maybe you could
Well,
start at square one.
Well, it was an incredible piece of luck, really, because I spend a lot of time on social media, like lots of us do these days, scrolling, doom scrolling, I suppose it's now called. And I just happened to spot in a post that was made by the Lord Lieutenant of Warwickshire an interior with some people in it. And my mind was immediately cast to the wall because I am fascinated by old masters. And whenever I see a painting in the background, I want to know what it is. And in this case, it was just a photograph of a big room with lots of volunteers in it who had been doing something for the Lord Lieutenant. And I spotted this painting with a round arch in a golden frame. And immediately my mind went to this very famous set of Elizabethan portraits that were made for Ralph Sheldon in the 1590s.
Mm.
A very famous set because it's one of the grandest that was ever commissioned in its day. And they have this very distinctive feature of all having round tops, which for 16th century portraits is actually, relatively rare. So I immediately thought, well, okay, I've got to go away and look at this now. And so I hit the books, and within about an hour, I knew which books to look at, which resources to look at, which is another important part of being an art historian, knowing where to find the answers you're looking for, and had worked out that out of the 22 paintings that Ralph Sheldon had commissioned, the majority are lost. And the portrait that Ralph had of Henry VIII was also lost. Nobody had known where it is, for at least over 100 years, it seems, probably even since it was sold in 1781. So I immediately went to find some, other pictures of it, and it just, within an hour, all the evidence came together that this was Ralph Sheldon's lost painting. So I wrote a blog about it and thought, talked to some of my friends in Warwick. We eventually got to see the painting in person, me and my friend Aaron Manning, who's also a local historian. And, I thought, wow, what a great story. I wrote a blog, the local paper saw it posted on my Twitter account and then said, oh, can we write a piece about it? And I thought, yeah, of course, this is a lovely local story. And after it was in the paper, the BBC got in touch. And then after the BBC got in touch, CNN got in touch, and then Fox News got in touch.
Oh.
And although I wasn't on television, I was just speaking to reporters. And then I got a phone radio interview in Australia, and it's just snowballed. But I think what it really shows is, there is, and as we know, a sort of a cult of the Tudors. There's an army of historians who, produce books after books every year on Elizabeth I, Henry VIII, and the fascination for that king should not be underestimated. And I feel very lucky that, a story that I thought was just going to be in a local paper has now crossed the globe.
Yeah, and we were talking about this before the podcast began about celebrity status of people of any period. I was talking about Alexander the Great will sell works of art. So it's where it becomes synchronic. It doesn't matter whether it's a living celebrity or someone from history, from ancient history. It will still be a very important part of the cultural and therefore usually financial value of any kind of art object, if you like.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's also particularly the case about British or English paintings because, if we're honest, as much as you and I, I'm sure, love Elizabethan portraits, compared to the quality that existed in Venice at that same period, maybe, aesthetically they're not as pleasing sometimes, although that, is a subjective argument. But it's the history of these sitters, have a portrait of Elizabeth I. Sotheby's last summer had a magnificent painting of Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife, and it's this sort of interest, this fascination of historical figures, and particularly women, quite understandably and quite rightly. And now the Earl of Jersey's portrait that Sotheby sold last year, it made over £2 million over its 600 to 800,000 estimate last summer, and now it is the poster, painting for the NPG's current exhibition on the wives of King Henry VIII. So it just shows you that we live in a very contemporary world, and everyone is quite understandably fascinated by what Elon Musk is saying and where AI is going. But there's still a fascination for historical figures with good stories, and it should not be underestimated.
No, absolutely. And it might well be confidential, but you said about whenever you see paintings in a room, you want to know what they are. Can I ask what's on the wall behind you, or is that something you'd rather keep to yourself?
Well, this is something that I bought at Saunders. Saunders is in Essex. That's the one, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, auction house.
Just at a sale, and it was very inexpensive, and I really like it because it dates to about 1800, and men used to wear these double-breasted jackets, and I absolutely love it. I also like the fact that it's an old fellow who looks rather grumpy, and I have a theory that it's a portrait of William Haley, the actor, or someone like that. But
yes.
I saw it, and I just love that evocative sense of history that it gives to me, and I get to look at it every day, and it just shows you don't have to buy these things at Sotheby's if you don't want. There are some very, very good value pictures to be found in antique shops, local auction houses.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's I suppose it's a bit of an irony that I'm hiding it behind my head right now.
But I was just going to ask, you were talking about that you can actually read and play the music in Holbein's Ambassadors. Can you read any of the writing on the papers in front of him?
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think was it intentionally blurred, or do you think it was there once and you just can't read it anymore?
No, I think there was never anything written on these particular ones, but sometimes you get inscriptions and things. Again, on that Catherine Parr portrait, there was even on her sleeve in the sort of that black and white needlework, quotations of the Bible. One of the things I think people love about old masters is that attention to detail and the profuse amount of detail, whether it's fashion, clothing, whether it's things like inscriptions or music, or the details of somebody's face or their warts or whatever. This is sometimes what we love about them. You just sort of get sucked into this world, not only of beauty but of mystery too, which I think also keeps us going sometimes.
I was just going to finish by, well, a couple of questions maybe. Whether you would have any advice for any students of the history of art or art and its markets or fine and decorative art who are thinking of going into maybe the more commercial career in the art world. Would you have any advice for them? And then the other question I was going to ask you is, which is kind of linked, I guess, where would you say the art world might be in 2030? And do you think there would be any difference in the kind of people who are collecting old masters in terms of ethnic background, age, in say 10 years' time? Two questions, really.
Yes, well, to answer your first, I think the best piece of advice I can give is work very hard. If you're starting off your career, don't be afraid, if you're going into an auction house or a dealer, to start at a level that you can work your way up in. I think, I was an intern at Sotheby's just after my master's degree, and doing simple and being given simple jobs, doing them well, you will get a more interesting job next time if you've proven that the fact that you're diligent, that you're thorough, that you can do your job well, and that bit of responsibility that you took on, you made it your own. That, I think, is the most important thing. And I'm, despite what people say about the art market and the art world, I think, hard work does always pay off. And I also would say, don't be afraid, if you're coming out of a master's degree or even a BA, and you don't know exactly what your niche is, don't be afraid to try things out. Again, I've known colleagues who started off being administrators in a department at Sotheby's and now are, cataloging impressionist pictures, or they're, doing house sales and valuations. You can start in one place and you might end up somewhere completely different. Don't be afraid to give it a go, and to also realize that you're at the beginning of your career. Who knows what path is ahead? But I think it's that being open-minded and being open to working hard is, to me, the key to everything. And then to your second question, which is also a particularly good one, what is the art and the old master market going to be like in 2030? Well, I think, despite what people would say sometimes, is that the thirst for top quality old masters by the great masters, and I'm saying the likes of Rubens, Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Botticelli, is only going to go up and up. I think what we're seeing at the moment, even just this summer, in Paris, for example, they were breaking records with 18th century paintings that everyone thought was, didn't have any life left in them whatsoever. I mean, the desire and the thirst for top quality pictures in excellent condition from important collections, I don't think is going anywhere. Of course, auction houses these days are, expanding their offering, and the incredible rise of interest in luxury, basketball shoes, jerseys, handbags, I think can only complement the diverse objects that an auction house or the art world is capable of sustaining and offering to the public. But I think that thirst for the top quality pictures is going nowhere. But also, I think one of the most interesting things to keep an eye out for are paintings which have been overlooked in the past, and that, of course, is female artists. I think, every dealer worth his salt and an auctioneer specialist is looking for works that have been passed over. Female artists, of course. I find it fascinating that the Tate's current show on British female artists, the majority of those paintings which are still in private collections and are still possible will come up to the market one day, is a very exciting prospect. So overlooked things, but also I think paintings, in the world of old masters, let's say, that were produced in non-European places. I'm particularly thinking of paintings that were produced by Western artists in India. The results that are coming through for not only we had this beautiful portrait of a Mughal lady by Francesco Rinaldi, which sold, I think, several decades ago for a good price, but was sold eventually at Sotheby's in December for over 800,000, and the Met bought it. This interest in paintings of non-white sitters, is also going nowhere. But also, for example, scenes of foreign and interesting places done by Western artists are, increasingly in demand. Watercolors by William Thomas Daniel that would sell 20 years ago for a few £1,000s are now selling towards 100,000 in the tens. This I think, the search for these sorts of rare and exciting examples of Western eyes looking at other places, is also something that I don't see is going anywhere.
And again, it's an example of our contemporary lens changing the fashions for old master collecting. Actually, another question I wanted to ask you, this is a really difficult one, I think. One of my current students, he's trying to compare the market for European old masters with mainly Chinese old masters, Eastern old masters, if you like, because the Art Market Report that you're probably aware of, written by Claire McAndrew every year, she, a few years back, started not just talking about the old master market, but actually talking about the old master market and then dividing it into European old masters and Chinese old masters. Do you think that's apples and oranges? Do you think that is the right way to approach this subject, to actually see Chinese scroll paintings of the 13th, 14th century in themselves masterpieces? We know that. But do you think it's a strange thing to try and do to put those markets together? It's a difficult question.
I think, well, I'm always open-minded to such things. And, again, we're hearing a lot these days, and the auction houses are doing a fantastically interesting job of cross-category sales. And sometimes it does surprise you that some collectors of certain objects go for others. And whenever that does happen, it's a it's a validation that this is, this works. Of course, all of this information is confidential, so
Yeah.
I can't give any concrete examples, but why not?
Mm.
I think it's just about, finding examples of collectors that are, cross-category enough. But I have to admit that, any great work of art, whether it be a Botticelli portrait or a Bronzino portrait or a Rembrandt, it never ceases to surprise, that sometimes for these, really top paintings, and if you're lucky enough, you get to see quite a few of them at Sotheby's. They do go to interesting places, and the
Mm.
diversity of collectors these days is growing.
Mhm.
But I think maybe if we were to talk again in 2030, we'll have a better sense of how much it has grown and how quickly it's grown. I think it might be too early to say just yet.
Well, if I'm around in 2:30, I will perhaps contact you again. So, Adam, on behalf of all the listeners, I'd like to thank you very much. That this was really absorbing, discussion of your background and how you got into art and history, and it's just really, really refreshing to hear a, if I may say so, a younger person with so much enthusiasm talking about that old master market, which is often sort of seen probably through fear and ignorance, of classical mythology and biblical stories and so on. I think this is often an issue, or history itself. We've been talking a lot about portraits of Henry VIII and Catherine Parr and so on. Well, I think that was another thing, and I think you would agree with me. Carry on reading, read and carry on reading about mythology, and read. The Bible is a very difficult text to read through, I think. It has long periods of sort of quite boring genealogies and so on, but you should certainly know the big stories, and those stories are amazing, and that's often also what sells old masters. So
Yes.
anyway, without yeah, I'm sure you agree with that. And so that, I think that's another thing we should add as a piece of advice to people, because often they won't touch old masters because they think, I don't even understand what's going on in them. Maybe you could just
Well,
comment a little bit on that.
there is that case, let's say, I don't particularly understand the work of Murillo that much, that 17th century
Mm.
Spanish painter, because I sometimes find his religious paintings just a bit too, you have to be an intense Catholic to
Yes.
understand them. But actually, I think really great works of art sometimes need no explanation, really,
Mm.
or very little. That's the magic of some
Good
of them.
point.
I think that Botticelli Man of Sorrows, which sold
Mm.
Sotheby's New York for an enormous price. That was it's just a remarkable image in its own right. You don't have to
Absolutely.
particularly understand what Christ represents. And if you don't know, you will have fun trying to find out. And
Exactly.
and but like I said, a great work of art transcends sometimes what its story or narrative of. But it doesn't always have to be. Sometimes it's good to have a portrait of a historic figure for what their biography is, and there's a great
Mm.
story and a endless bit behind that. But I think to me, Old Masters is historical escapism at its best. You can go anywhere, any country in Europe, any civilization, any period, biblical, landscape, portrait. You will go to places that you will never be able to go with your own feet, But painters will take you there, and that's, I think, really what it excites me.
Wonderful, wonderful. Anyway, thank you again, Adam, and hopefully we may talk again in a few years' time.
Pleasure. Thank you.